Millions watched and a nation held its breath as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood, calm and unshaken, to confront the most powerful judge in America. In a congressional hearing that would soon stun the world, Chief Justice John Roberts looked her dead in the eye and called someone unqualified. Hours later, he would claim it wasn't about her, but it was too late. Jasmine didn't just let it slide. She exposed a truth so profound that it left him cornered, silent, and unable to defend the weight of his own words. Now the country is asking, if she was so unqualified, why was she the only one brave enough to speak? Stay with us, because this is a story worth every second of your time. If you believe that power must be held accountable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. You are not just a viewer, you are a witness to history, and your voice matters in this fight for truth. The air in room 2175 of the Rayburn House office building had never felt heavier. The grand marble walls, usually stoic and indifferent, seemed to lean in, silent witnesses to what would become one of the most explosive hearings in congressional memory. The room was packed, a sea of dark suits and hushed anticipation. Reporters, legal scholars, and spectators buzzed with a quiet energy, a tension that was almost a physical presence. At the center of it all, seated with the regal posture of a man who had defined an era of American law, was Chief Justice John Roberts. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of judicial neutrality, unreadable. To his right, a stark contrast in her focused intensity, sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her black blazer was sharply pressed, a small gold cross gleaming at her neck, a folder thick with documents resting in her hands. She waited for her turn, her eyes not on the cameras, not on her notes, but fixed directly on the man whose decisions had shaped the nation's most powerful court. When her name was finally called, she rose slowly, not with the haste of a politician eager for the spotlight, but with the deliberate grace of a warrior stepping into an arena. "Mr. Chief Justice," she began, her voice steady but firm, cutting through the murmurs of the room. "I believe the American people deserve to know if the Supreme Court still answers to the law or to the donors behind closed doors." There was a flicker of something behind Robert's eyes, a barely perceptible twitch, perhaps the ghost of a smirk, but he said nothing. Jasmine continued, flipping open the folder. "You've accepted invitations to private retreats funded by groups who later filed amicus briefs in front of your court. You failed to disclose gifts that, by any civilian standard, would raise red flags. And yet this body is told to trust that your honor is its own safeguard." The room grew stiller with every word. When lower courts are bound by codes of conduct, but the highest court is not, that's not balance. That's untouchable power. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried with it the weight of every voice that had gone unheard in front of that court. She laid down one final statement like a gavel strike. Isn't justice supposed to be blind, not selectively mute? The story of this confrontation didn't begin in the gilded halls of Congress. It began on the streets, in the quiet resolve of a young woman who learned early that justice was not a guarantee, but a fight. Jasmine Crockett was not born into power. Her history is one of resilience, forged in the fires of a system that often saw her as an outsider. She was an activist before she was a politician, a public defender, before she was a congresswoman. Her past is marked by a pivotal moment, a story she rarely tells, but that defines her every action. At 19, she was arrested, not for theft, not for violence, but for protesting. She stood outside a courthouse, holding a sign for a black teenager who had been sentenced to decades in prison for a minor crime, while a privileged peer received probation for assault. That arrest, that feeling of being silenced by the very system meant to protect, became the catalyst for her entire career. It wasn't anger that drove her to law school. It was a cold, clear determination to understand the machinery of power so she could one day dismantle its injustices from the inside. She learned that the law had cracks, and in those cracks, bias and hypocrisy thrived. This history is the bedrock of her character, calm under pressure, meticulously prepared, and armed with a profound understanding that true authority comes not from a title, but from integrity. On the other side of the dais sat Chief Justice John Roberts, the embodiment of the institution itself. A conservative jurist, his public persona was one of intellectual rigor, of a man standing above the political fray, a guardian of tradition and judicial restraint. For years, he had been perceived as the steady hand on a court increasingly fractured by ideology. Yet beneath this veneer of untouchable authority, whispers had grown. Critics pointed to a pattern of decisions that seemed to favor powerful corporate interests and a resistance to implementing a formal, binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court, a standard to which every other federal judge in the nation is held. The system he represented, the highest court in the land, operated in a sphere of its own making, where accountability was a matter of personal discretion, not public mandate. The tension leading up to this hearing had been building for months. A series of investigative reports had shed light on undisclosed trips and lavish gifts accepted by justices, raising uncomfortable questions about influence and access. The American public was growing restless, their faith in the court's impartiality eroding. It was into this charged atmosphere that Jasmine Crockett stepped, not just as a congresswoman, but as the voice of that growing unease. The stage was set in room 2175, a place of immense power and symbolism. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, leather, and the unspoken weight of history. It was a room designed to intimidate, to reinforce the hierarchy of power. But on this day, the oppressive formality of the chamber would not serve as a shield. It would become the very arena where that power was challenged, where the silence would speak louder than any gavel. The stakes were immense. For Roberts, it was about defending the sanctity and reputation of his court and his own legacy. For Crockett, it was about something far more fundamental, the principle that no one, not even the Chief Justice of the United States, is above the law. Before we step into that hearing room, if you're ready to see power challenged, hit that like button to show you're with her. The confrontation that follows will be one for the history books. The confrontation began not with a shout, but with a quiet, calculated strike. After Jasmine laid out her initial challenge to the court's ethical vacuum, Roberts slowly adjusted his microphone. He paused, a deliberate, theatrical beat, as if calculating the exact weight of the words he would use to dismiss her. His hands folded neatly before him, a gesture rehearsed in decades of courtroom decorum. When he finally spoke, it was not in outrage, nor in haste. His tone was surgical, cold, and smooth. "Congresswoman," he said, locking eyes with her, "I don't believe individuals who have not earned the requisite legal and constitutional gravitas should attempt to lecture the Supreme Court on ethics." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Then came the line that detonated the room. "Frankly, I don't think people who are unqualified should be preaching morality to the High Court." The silence that followed didn't just linger. It took over. It settled into the corners of the room like a thick, unmoving fog, pressing down on every breath, every blink, every thought. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. No one in room 2175 dared to speak. Not the aides, not the chairperson, not even the reporters, whose fingers hovered motionless above their keyboards, too stunned to type. The weight of Robert's words still hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Unqualified. A single word, cracked through the air like a gunshot muffled in velvet, calculated enough to wound, but vague enough to escape consequence. All eyes, instinctively and silently, turned to Jasmine Crockett. In that lineup of polished suits, flag pins, and congressional authority, she was the only black woman seated at the dais. The room was waiting to see if she would erupt, fold, or disappear. But she did none of those things. She sat completely still, unmoving, unbothered, unreadable. Her shoulders didn't stiffen. Her hands didn't ball into fists. Instead, she lowered her eyes back to her documents, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than any voice. One by one, she flipped to the next page in her binder, with the kind of casual care that made everyone else in the room suddenly aware of how hard they were holding their breath. She picked up her pen and calmly resumed writing something in the margin, as if nothing had been said at all. As if the most powerful judge in the country hadn't just tried to publicly reduce her to silence with one backhanded sentence. Her face remained perfectly composed, but her silence wasn't retreat. It was control. It was the kind of control that came from surviving rooms colder than this one, crueler than this one, far more dishonest than this one. 10 seconds passed, but in the world of live politics, 10 seconds of silence might as well be an eternity. People shifted in their seats. The tension became a character in the room. Even Chief Justice Roberts subtly adjusted the clasp of his hands, as if the chill in her silence had reached him too. And then finally she moved. With a precision so deliberate it felt like choreography, Jasmine placed her pen down beside her notepad. She lifted her head, not quickly, not with flair, but with the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Her eyes met his. No tremble, no heat, no panic. Her expression wasn't anger. It was something colder, something that spoke of years of being underestimated, of being questioned, of being measured by standards that shifted every time she rose to meet them. "Chief Justice," she said, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel through silk. "For the sake of clarity, because clarity matters in a courtroom, doesn't it?" She let the question hang, rhetorical but weighted. "When you said, 'I don't think people who are unqualified should preach morality to the High Court,' I'd like to ask you directly." Her eyes didn't blink. "Were you referring to me?" She waited, but not long. "Because when I look around this room, I don't see anyone else who meets the description your eyes were locked on when you said it." And then, one final line, soft as a whisper but sharper than any gavel. "So I'll ask again, Chief Justice. Did you mean me?" The question had been asked with terrifying clarity, and now it hovered in the air like a guillotine suspended by silence. What do you think is going through her mind in this moment? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're about to see her fire back, and you don't want to miss it. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her calmness was a loaded gun on the table, one everyone could see but no one dared touch. And yet, instead of meeting the moment with honesty, or even with the kind of veiled dignity that had kept him above political noise for decades, Chief Justice John Roberts reached for the safest defense in the book: deflection. He leaned slightly forward, fingers laced, his tone polished and deliberately vague. "My statement was meant to reflect a general standard," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, like marble covering rot. "It was not directed at any particular individual." The words sounded clean, but they were slippery, designed not to answer, but to escape. The problem was, the room had seen it. Everyone had. The timing, the angle of his eyes, the way the sentence had landed like a scalpel aimed with surgical intent. And now, here he was, pretending it was academic, pretending it was theoretical, pretending that the blade hadn't just sliced across the only black woman in the room, right in front of an entire nation. Jasmine sat motionless for a breath, then another. And then she leaned forward just a bit, enough to close the distance without threatening, enough to speak not with force, but with precision. "Chief Justice," she said, "I asked a question, and instead of answering it, you stepped behind a wall of abstraction and hoped we'd all politely nod." Her voice remained steady, her face unreadable, but her words struck with the weight of stone. "That's not clarity, that's cowardice dressed up in legal syntax." Roberts blinked. Once, twice. His fingers shifted slightly on the table. The man who had stood before presidents, who had wielded words like instruments in landmark rulings, was now staring at a woman half his age who refused to flinch, who refused to be gaslit into silence. "If this were a courtroom," Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering, "you would demand an answer on the record. And yet, here in front of Congress, you dodge with semantics." Her eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something more dangerous: focus. "If I, as a sitting member of this body, can be targeted, intentionally or not, and the moment I press for clarity, the Chief Justice hides behind vague principles, then what does that say to every person who doesn't have a microphone in front of them?" The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulled taut across opposing ships. No one looked away. No one breathed too loud. And Roberts hesitated. His reply came slower now, no longer lined with confidence. "Congresswoman, I believe you may have misunderstood," he began, But even he seemed unsure of where the sentence was going. It trailed slightly at the edges, unconvincing even to his own ears. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to, because the power had already moved. The balance had already shifted. For the first time in the hearing, Roberts wasn't the one commanding the space. He was defending himself inside it, and the rest of the room knew it too. The chairman didn't gavel. The aides didn't murmur. The press gallery remained frozen. It wasn't decorum holding them still. It was gravity. The gravity of watching a moment that wasn't just about Robert's words or Jasmine's question. It was about what happened when someone who had always been on the outside walked into the most sacred hall of American power and refused to be quiet. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was forming, and every person in that room could feel it coming. What they didn't know was that the real storm was about to be unleashed, not with words, but with facts. She had given him every chance. She had asked the question with precision, waited through the silence, even endured the deflection. But now Jasmine Crockett was done waiting. With a calmness that felt more dangerous than any raised voice, she reached down, tapped her tablet, and brought it to life. The glow of the screen reflected off her hands as rows of information unfolded. Tidy columns of names, dates, and monetary figures, each one a thread in a web few had dared to pull. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the tablet toward the committee. The room leaned in. "Let's not talk in circles," she said. "Let's look at some facts." Her voice was even, but it had changed. There was an edge now, like someone tired of asking for permission to be heard. She scrolled down the screen without looking away from Roberts. "The Liberty Civic Foundation," she began. "You gave a speech at their retreat in Aspen on June 14th. 3 months later, they filed a legal brief in the Randall versus Zenith case, which your court ruled on, and you voted in their favor. Would you like to tell this committee who paid for your travel and hotel during that event? Because according to their own financial records, they covered everything for special judicial guests." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed like a weight, slow and deliberate. "That ruling changed environmental laws across the country, and now we find out that the group who benefited flew the Chief Justice out to a private resort to talk behind closed doors." She tapped again. Another entry came up. "Let's talk about forward horizons," she said. "July 9th, Washington, D.C. Hilton, a private legal summit. You were the keynote speaker. On the invite list were CEOs from 5 major tech companies. All of them had cases coming up in federal court." She paused just long enough for the silence to bite. "Do you think it's wrong to ask why a Supreme Court justice is spending weekends talking privately with people whose companies have lawsuits that depend on your vote?" Her words were steady, her face unreadable, but the force behind her calm was unmistakable. "Tell me this," she continued, eyes locked on his. "Who exactly is the one that's not qualified? The person bringing these details forward? Or the one whose name keeps showing up at meetings with billion-dollar interests and then shows up again in rulings that help those same interests?" Her voice was cool, her delivery clean. "Because if asking these questions makes me unqualified, then maybe what you're really saying is people like me shouldn't be asking them at all." The next slide lit up. "Here's a flight log from October. A private jet registered to Crestview Holdings. They were involved in a major commerce case your court chose not to hear just days before that decision. You attended a private event sponsored by that same company in Arizona." She raised an eyebrow. "Should we believe that's just a coincidence?" She leaned in just slightly. "This isn't guesswork. It's public records. It's your name, their money, your vote, and a pattern that keeps repeating." Another pause. Her voice softened but cut deeper. "So, if you think I'm the one who doesn't belong here, then tell me, does being qualified mean staying quiet while all this goes on?" She lowered her voice one last time, almost to a whisper, but it carried through the room like a drumbeat. "Because from where I sit, being qualified means having the guts to ask the questions no one else will." And then she said nothing more, because she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. The silence no longer belonged to Roberts. It belonged to her. If you believe facts are the ultimate weapon against corruption, smash that like button right now. The fallout from this moment is just beginning. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved an inch since she began reading. She didn't need to. The weight of her words did the moving for her. Across the long, polished hearing table, Chief Justice John Roberts sat completely still, but something beneath the surface had shifted. His grip on the edge of his chair had tightened visibly, his fingers white at the knuckles. The skin stretched taut like a man trying to anchor himself in a storm he could no longer control. The mask of judicial confidence, the practiced neutrality, the carefully measured tone, it was cracking in slow motion. His shoulders, once squared in pride, had begun to draw inward, ever so slightly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. Because Jasmine wasn't making accusations, she was unearthing evidence. And with every line she read, another inch of the myth surrounding him was peeled away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. There was no need for theatrics. She simply scrolled, paused, and read. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but what came out of her mouth had the precision of a scalpel and the weight of a sledgehammer. June 14th, she began again. Aspen, Colorado. You spoke at a retreat held by the Liberty Civic Foundation. They flew you in, covered all your expenses through a donor fund. Then 3 months later, they submitted a brief to the court in the Randall versus Zenith case, and you voted in their favor. She turned a page. July 9th, you attended a private summit at the D.C. Hilton, hosted by Forward Horizons. Tech executives with cases before your court were there. You gave the keynote speech. Their group reimbursed your travel. That's not guessing. That's paperwork. She looked up just for a second, long enough to meet his eyes and make sure he was still listening. Really listening. He was. His jaw was tight now, his mouth closed so firmly it looked like he was holding something in. But there was nothing left to hold. She looked back down. October 2nd, she continued. Scottsdale, Arizona. Crestview Holdings hosted an event. You flew there on their private jet, tail number 5XK Zell. 3 days later, the court refused to hear Fletcher versus Commerce, a case that directly affected Crestview's business. You were the final vote in that decision. Jasmine paused, not because she was unsure, but because she knew the weight of silence now belonged to her too. Then softly she continued. May 18th. You were a guest at a Rhodes Civic Trust dinner in Chicago. That group funded a brief for the Trent Visive Federal Commission case, ruled on by your court a few weeks later. Again, 5-4. Again, your vote made the difference. She closed the screen for a moment, folded her hands, and rested them gently on the table. Not a single word had been shouted, but the hearing room now felt as if it were made of glass. Tight, fragile, one sharp movement away from shattering. Still, Robert said nothing. His face was pale now, his hands clasped tighter, elbows resting more heavily against the leather arms of his chair. And Jasmine, she didn't even smile. She wasn't performing. She wasn't campaigning. She was stating what needed to be heard in the one place where it was hardest to say it. Her restraint was more powerful than outrage, her facts more devastating than accusations, and she knew it. So tell me, Chief Justice, she said finally, her voice steady, clear, and quiet enough to make the room lean in. When you told me I wasn't qualified to talk about ethics, was that really about qualifications? She let that question hang, not for effect, but because sometimes the silence after truth is louder than anything else. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, but the echo felt deafening. Inside room 2175, the stillness remained, almost sacred. Outside, however, the world had already begun to move. Jasmine didn't stop walking, not for the cameras, not for the whispers, not even for the security detail that instinctively fell in beside her. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble corridor of the Rayburn House office building, each step sounding louder than it should have, as if the building itself were listening. Her eyes were forward, her face calm, but behind her, a storm was gathering, not of weather, but of attention. The moment she turned the final corner into the main hallway, it hit her. Not the press, not the chaos, but the quiet. A crowd had formed, but there was no shouting, no frenzy, no flashbulbs. Just a wave of bodies, staffers, reporters, passers-by, who parted to let her through. Not because they were told to, but because something in them knew they had just witnessed history. Someone held up a phone, live streaming. She caught the words on the screen for just a second. She stood up. Another reporter whispered, not to her, but to a producer beside them. I've never seen a hearing end like that. Still, no one spoke directly to Jasmine. Not yet. It was as if the power she carried hadn't fully dissipated from the room and was still radiating off her skin like heat after a fire. Outside the building, the story had already exploded on social media. The clip of her final statement was being reshared at a dizzying speed. The moment she stood, the calm in her voice, the weight of her last words. Being qualified isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you. We're already being subtitled in a dozen languages. The image of her standing while Robert sat frozen in place became an instant symbol. Someone posted a split screen, her rising, him sinking. The caption read, "Truth doesn't wear robes." In a dorm room at Howard University, a freshman law student named Erica paused her exam prep to watch the clip. She didn't blink. She didn't move. When it ended, she whispered, "That's it. That's the reason I'm here." In a break room at a Chicago factory, a 58-year-old machinist who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before leaned forward toward the small TV and muttered, "Damn, that woman's got steel in her bones." In a news studio in New York, producers yelled over one another, "Clear the 6:30. This goes top of show." In a coffee shop in Oakland, in a courthouse in Philadelphia, in a mother's kitchen in Atlanta, people watched and then they shared. Not just the clip, not just the quote, their stories. Watched a black woman take down the highest judge in the country with nothing but truth. I'm crying. I was told I wasn't qualified because of where I came from. Today, I watched someone prove otherwise. My daughter just asked me what it means to be qualified. I showed her Jasmine's clip. She smiled for the first time in a week. By the time Jasmine reached the Capitol Rotunda, her phone had buzzed 31 times. She hadn't looked at it once. Inside the hearing room, staffers had begun to pack up. But something was different now. They moved more slowly, more carefully, like cleaning up after something sacred, not procedural. One junior staffer, new to the Hill, barely out of grad school, stood holding his folder, staring at Roberts. Not with anger, but with awe. Not at the Chief Justice, but at the silence Jasmine had left behind. The silence that said, "Everything has changed now. This is how truth spreads, and you can be a part of it." Share this video now and help make sure this story reaches everyone who needs to see what real courage looks like. They called it the moment that broke the robe. Not officially, of course, not in legal briefs or committee reports, but across the country, in living rooms, lecture halls, and newsroom roundtables. People said it the way survivors speak of the moment a storm split the sky. And as the clip of Jasmine Crockett standing before Chief Justice John Roberts reached its 100 millionth view, America wasn't just reacting with admiration, it was dividing. The backlash came fast, but not in the way people expected. It didn't come for her, it came for him. Within 24 hours, the Supreme Court's Public Information Office released a terse, 3-line statement. Chief Justice Roberts acknowledges the misunderstanding during the April 22nd hearing. He affirms his respect for all members of Congress and regrets any confusion that may have resulted. It landed with a dull thud. No apology, no ownership, just cold bureaucratic distance. The internet didn't miss it. "Regrets confusion," one headline read. He wasn't confused, he was caught. What followed was something far more intense than a PR blunder. It was an unraveling. At law schools across the country, professors scrapped their scheduled lectures to break down the hearing, frame by frame. Students stood up in crowded lecture halls and read Jasmine's words aloud, not as testimony, but as a manifesto. The legal blogosphere detonated. Even the normally reserved American Bar Association released a cautious statement. Recent events highlight the urgent need for a binding ethical code applicable to all justices. Then came the calls from Congress. What began as a symbolic gesture turned into something bigger when 3 Republicans, under pressure from constituents, broke ranks and backed to formal inquiry. Cable news split down ideological lines, but even conservative anchors struggled to defend what the country had seen. The real backlash, the one that stuck, wasn't aimed at Jasmine's tone. It was aimed at the Supreme Court itself. For decades, the highest court in the land had operated without a formal ethics code. Jasmine's questions had turned discretion into exposure. Her tablet didn't just contain dates and names, it contained precedent. Now the country wanted answers. An independent watchdog group filed a formal Freedom of Information Act request seeking travel records for all 9 justices. The Washington Post's investigative unit began a series titled Justice and Influence. And in a stunning move, a bipartisan bill was announced, the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act, its nickname on the Hill, the Crockett Clause. In a press conference, the sponsoring senator didn't mince words. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just call out a moment, she exposed a pattern. This isn't about vengeance, it's about accountability. Roberts, for his part, remained silent. But silence wasn't protection anymore. Not when the country had seen him stare down a woman speaking truth, say nothing, and then claim it wasn't about her. The damage wasn't just reputational, it was institutional. Confidence in the Supreme Court plummeted to a record low. In the legal community, something deeper shifted. Young lawyers began citing Crockett's hearing not just as commentary, but as a case study. And in every corner of the culture, the phrase "she stood, he sat" became something more than a recap. It became a standard. In a world built to reward compliance, Jasmine Crockett did something dangerous. She refused to be quiet. Not in protest, not in outrage, but in truth. Cold, calm, inescapable truth. She didn't demand respect with volume or posture. She didn't beg for dignity. She embodied it. And in doing so, she exposed a fault line that runs through every institution, every courtroom, every boardroom and classroom in America. The myth of merit, the belief that titles and tradition are proof of integrity, that robes are proof of righteousness, that power by its nature deserves deference. What Jasmine showed the world, what she made undeniable, is that none of those things are true without accountability. And accountability only exists when someone is brave enough to ask, who gave you that power and why haven't you earned it? This wasn't just about a courtroom. It wasn't just about a hearing. It was about every woman who's ever walked into a room and been told she didn't belong there because her voice didn't sound right, or her skin didn't look right, or her questions made people uncomfortable. It was about every person who's ever been passed over, looked past, talked down to, and then gaslit when they tried to name it. Jasmine stood not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she knew what it meant to have no one else willing to stand with you. And that's the moral heartbeat of this story. When no one shields you, when no one lifts you up, standing becomes the most radical act you can commit. Justice, real justice, doesn't happen in marble chambers or behind closed doors. It happens when someone demands it out loud and in full view of those who've spent lifetimes learning how to silence dissent. It happens not when the system reforms itself, but when someone refuses to carry its silence anymore. Jasmine Crockett didn't confront the Chief Justice of the United States. She interrupted a ritual, a centuries-old performance in which power pretends to be neutral, while the rest of the room is expected to play along. She broke that script, and in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that justice cannot exist where courage is punished and silence is rewarded. But perhaps the most piercing lesson isn't about what she said, it's about what he didn't. John Roberts, a man entrusted with the highest judicial authority in the land, had every chance to clarify, to correct, to protect the dignity of someone wrongly accused, even if it wasn't his intent. But he chose not to. And that choice revealed the most dangerous kind of injustice. The kind that hides behind politeness. The kind that smiles while it denies. The kind that speaks in generalities so it never has to take responsibility. Jasmine named that cowardice for what it was, and in doing so, she exposed a truth far more threatening than corruption. It was apathy in power, and that is the enemy of democracy. This is the story of a woman who was arrested for protesting injustice at 19 and decades later faced down the most powerful judge in America without flinching. She didn't do it with anger, she did it with memory. She carried every insult, every microaggression, every slammed door and whispered doubt into that hearing room and turned them into testimony. Not for herself, but for every young girl who's ever been told to smile more. For every first-gen law student who's ever been told they don't fit. For every Black woman who's ever been called too much and then too little in the same breath. Jasmine Crockett spoke for all of them, and for once the world listened. The moral of this story is not that power is bad, it's that power without introspection is dangerous, that tradition without truth is a lie, that ethics are not self-assigned, they are proven, and above all, that dignity doesn't flow from robes or gavels or Senate seats. It flows from the willingness to stand for what is right, even when you are standing alone. Because sometimes the robe doesn't symbolize wisdom, it hides from it. And sometimes the person who enters the room with the least protection leaves with the most truth. So the next time someone says you're not qualified, remember this moment. Remember the silence that followed her question, the tremble in power when it was finally forced to look at itself. Remember the woman who stood, not because she was invited, but because she had earned the right to speak through fire. And remember that the world does not change because the powerful allow it. It changes because the brave insist. Qualification is not about pedigree. It's not about proximity to power. It's about what you do when the lights are brightest and the silence is deepest. It's about what you say when no one else will speak. And it's about whether your truth, when spoken aloud, makes the world a little more just or leaves it untouched. Jasmine Crockett made the world shake that day, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with truth. And in that truth, we found something rare. Not just a moment of accountability, but a blueprint for courage. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. If you want to be part of those who stand tall and fight for what's right, then like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story. Because in the fight for truth, every voice matters.